The major transition from being a Member of Parliament to my present role is that when I was the Member of Parliament, amongst other places, this building, they used to invite me here to see the Halley Orchestra. They no longer invite me to that, but I do get invited to the Security Industry Conference, which is obviously a step up in the professional ladder. So thank you for that. I just want to reflect on, if you like, the mistakes of the last Labour government in terms of policing, because whilst I would abound to say as I'm still a practising Labour politician, I can still run you through the hour-and-a-half lecture on the good things the last Labour government did if you want. But what I want to concentrate on is what they got wrong in policing, and they got a couple of things wrong in policing. One of those things was not to recognise the need for cultural change in policing, that had to be delivered actually on the ground and not top down. The second was that whilst National League tables are very attractive to politicians, it means you can turn around and say, don't blame me, I'll blame Mr. Allen there, because it's him that got it wrong. I gave him the target and he failed to hit it. Targets actually do generally miss the loading point. And the third thing was that the Welfare Labour government put in an awful lot of money into policing, and that did see record numbers of police officers, both here in this conurbation and more generally. What the government didn't do was insist on delivery of that money against a proper standards of public stewardship. Now, we're in a very different era now, and the reason I wanted to say those matters of confession it now allows me to say unkind things about the present coalition government, against the Labour government. Because we're living in an era of austerity. I don't want to convince anybody that I think it's the right policies, but nevertheless, we are in an era of austerity where every pound really never does count, and we have to calculate in a very different way. We're in an era, though, because of austerity, where by the kind of things that policing is asked to do is even more challenging, because the money, quite literally, is rolling out, and we need to find a very different way of working. I'll come on to part of what that is. We're also in an era, though, where the challenges that policing faces are changing all the time. The growth, for example, of cybercrime is something that, quite frankly, I don't think policing is yet up to speed. I'm not simply here in Greater Manchester, nowhere on this planet is policing yet up to speed with what the challenges of cybercrime. We're facing challenges, things like child sexual exploitation, which was there years ago, but probably we didn't realise the full depth and full scale and the challenges that faces now in terms of the resourcing of things like that. Challenges of a society where we recognise increasing number of vulnerable people, and mental health is mental illness, more to the point, makes a huge impact on what any senior police officer has to do, and what any of the most junior police officers faces literally on the streets of our conurbation. Those challenges, those changes have been, all the changes around issues like organised crime. We saw the very brutal murder of 2 police officers 18 months ago now in Greater Manchester. That was around the recognition that organised crime was posing challenges that probably we haven't taken on board before. And all this leads, I suppose, to what does this mean in terms of where do we go with policing? Well, the one thing that I'm absolutely convinced of is that the need for huge cultural change in policing is real. I think this is recognised by Greater Manchester's certainly top policing team, but the cultural change, everybody in this room probably knows, is much more difficult to achieve and to talk about. We can write the manual. Actually delivering it on the ground is where the real hard issues come in, and that cultural change is there because policing, in a way, quite right the target culture. It's quite easy to say, well, get your burglary rates down, you deploy an awful lot of resources. I could have said to the Academy of Openers, sexual violence, get sexual violence down, and an awful lot of policing resources being thrown at it can make that difference. But when you say across the board, you can't drive everything by targets. You can't have a realistic target. How many rapes do you allow for in your target every year? That ought to be a nonsense. It ought to be the wrong way of viewing the world. It ought to be nonsense to say we want a police force that's trusted by the local community. What's the target for trust? Is it 87.2? Well, it's not actually. It's got to be an ambition to have 100% trust in the public. We may just discount the criminal classes. So even amongst the criminal classes, actually, I think we do know that they're very often the people who want to work with the police, because they're quite often the things that we want our policing service to know. So issues like that are not simply targetable, and we have to change the culture of the way our police work. Now, I'm always very conscious that when I stand here with no experience of policing outside of us and being a citizen, I don't want to tell the policing how to do the job that they do. But I think it's important that policing is consistent with a number of things that make sense in the modern world. Policing always is political, not necessarily political, by the way, but political to the extent that if it doesn't reflect the demands of the general public, then it's not doing its job. If the public, even in a small area, feels that the police have abandoned that community, that crime rates are too high, it's no good saying that 87.2% of the community thinks policing is excellent, and the poor buggers who are wherever think that's absolutely awful, because that's not acceptable as the type of policing culture that we want to develop. The challenges and the need for change, the challenges of austerity, the challenges of new areas of activity that police are involved in, the need for cultural change is so obvious. But the biggest thing that is obvious to me is that there's almost nothing that I think Greater Manchester Police can achieve, or policing anywhere in this country can achieve, unless it's done in partnership. And one of the objectives I put into the Policing Crime Plan was the building of a strong partnerships. I put the obvious priorities in the Policing Crime Plan: driving down crime, antisocial behaviour, protecting vulnerable people, the capacity to deal properly with victims, the capacity to deal with terrorism or large-scale public events, but protecting our police service and protecting the reputation of our police service, all fairly no-brainer priorities. I did present a little bit, actually, having to write a policing crime plan. There was a statement of Northern apple pie and some things, but building partnership is so fundamental to modern policing. I just want to give you some examples, and many of you will recognise these as being very obvious things that policing needs to do, but I'm going to talk before about the protection of vulnerable people. I talked to two police officers in Nick Adley's former division a couple of weeks back, and they were saying to me that they were called to deal with a young man creating a bit of a nuisance of himself. And when they took control of him 7:30 in the evening, they realised his main issues were around mental health, mental illness. He'd had a little bit to drink, but that wasn't the real issue. It was mental health that was the problem. 2:30 in the morning, they finally were able to deliver that individual to two other people who happened to be two other members of Greater Manchester Police. Now, why do we as a society want our people with mental illness being dealt with by police officers? Lovely as though every single one of them is, sympathetic as though every single one of them is, they're not the right people to be dealing with mental health, because early intervention for the mentally ill is more effective, we know that. And early intervention by professionals is better than early intervention by the policing service. That was what I'm saying there, because tonight, tomorrow night, there may be somebody stood on one of the bridges over the M60 motorway who's going to threatening to jump off, and the person on the scene is likely to be somebody wearing a police uniform. But what we want is that person to be passported as quickly as possible to professional services. And what we're experiencing, and I say this is a pilot, but I think this will become the way we do things in one way or the other. The budget that I control on behalf of the police is now paying for people within the mental health service at one of the big hospitals, Oldham Royal, in the Northern Combination. And again, I'll give you a parallel story of what I just told you. I was talking to a young police officer in Oldham who said to me she picked up a young man in identical circumstances, being a bit boisterous. She was able to ring through to Oldham Royal, who said, yeah, we know this individual. We can give you the assurance that if you can get him delivered to his mum for the night, his mum is the one person that he listens to. She'll keep him under control at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, because he booked him for an appointment with the mental health practitioners. So that young man, instead of being a distressed individual going to do damage to you or me, or probably himself in any way, taking up an awful lot of his time, was somebody who was delivered into a safe, risk-free set of circumstances allowed the police officer involved to say if she'd done her duty properly, she wasn't required to spend the whole of her working time with this one individual, and she was back doing the work that we wanted her to do as a police officer and not as a surrogate nurse. Now, I can run through many different types of partnership working of a similar kind that are so obvious to me as we make sense with working with local authorities. It might not be as dramatic, it might not be as a community safety focus as what I've just described, but if we're looking for partnerships with other agencies, other organisations, we're looking at the moment to work with the City of Manchester on a common vehicle repair structure. Why does Greater Manchester Police have its own unique vehicle repair system when repairing vehicles doesn't require a blue uniform police officer? In fact, it probably requires not a blue uniform police officer, it requires a good mechanic. So actually having the good mechanics from the City Council working with the good mechanics from GMP is, to me, a bit of a no-brainer. Looking at things like payroll, how do we do payroll? Do we need a GMP payroll when it gets paid at the end of the month or the middle of the month, whenever it is? I don't think you care an awful lot to sign the cheque. So why don't we look to take cost out on the basis of looking for this kind of partnership approach? But if you look at one thing that ought to be very dear to, I think everybody's heart really in this room and beyond, biggest source of violence in our society isn't my mentally ill young man out on the streets. It's actually the person who goes home and attacks the partner or the family member. It's domestic violence is the biggest source of violence in our society. Absolutely certain the people who come along first when the 999 calls come in, they're going to be a police officer. But if we want to deal with the underlying problem, the issues that are involved in domestic violence, we've got to look at maybe the alcohol abuse that is part of it in many cases, the type of circumstances that leads the perpetrator into that kind of behaviour. And that isn't a policing role, it's a role that the police have to be able to passport through, maybe to adult social services, maybe to children's services, maybe to the health service, the drug and alcohol treatment services, whatever it might be. If we want to get young people out of criminal behaviour, young man I spoke to not so long ago, wanted a heroin addict. He said to me, the big change for him wasn't being arrested. He'd been in prison more times than he cared to remember, and he didn't mind prison. He could do it. So what made a difference for him? Two things. One was having a young child and making a decision that he didn't want his own child to grow up in the way he had grown up. And the second was that the drug treatment service was there when he was actually pointed in that direction by arrest, by court process, was actually being given proper assistance to get into the drug treatment service at the time he wanted it. So if we want to make our communities safer, it's building those community partnerships. It's actually, in the end, and this really is the major thing, I can talk about the public agencies, the councils, the mental health services, the drug and alcohol treatment services, the security industry, what can you do to make our communities safer? In the end, actually, I think it's even more basic than that. We've got to change the culture of policing, because every serious police officer will say to me one thing: if they want to both solve crime, but more importantly, prevent crime, it's working with other partners. It's working in the end with the real ultimate partner, which is you and me. It's about having a police service that's absolutely embedded in the community that we are, not as professionals, not with particular roles, but as you and me, members of the public, you and me as the people who can make our communities safer, as the eyes, the ears, but as the basic building blocks, the partnership we need. Now, I just want to finish, actually, Jeff, with me on moving away from the local to the national. You made the point before, I actually chair for this year the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. We set this up quite quickly about it. One of the reflections I would make, though, is that if we set modern policing into not simply its local context, the local context is all the things I think I've talked about, and with a chief constable who's absolutely committed to those values that underlie what I've been talking about and the need for that kind of change. One of the things at the moment that we do have to also recognise that policing, whilst all policing in the end is local, there clearly are national dimensions if we're talking about issues like counter-terrorism, if we're talking about issues like the serious and organised crime. That's just a warning when I've spoken enough. If we're going to deal with those issues now, we've got to make sure we've got a structure, if you like, a political structure of community safety where policing fits into that national agenda, operated rightly. And my, I suppose, real challenge, and it's something I just wanted to get off my chest this morning, is that we're not there yet. I described before a very interventionist of the government that thought we could run policing from Whitehall, and that's wrong. And it doesn't work that way. Policing has to start from the ground and move upwards. What we've got, unfortunately, now is the government almost the opposite end of that spectrum, where they're withdrawing from decision making so that they can say it's actually the fault of Greater Manchester Police or of the National Crime Agency or whatever. And we can't have that either. We've got to have a national government which is involved at every level with those who make decisions, political decisions, operational decisions, not for politicians to override the operational needs of the service. That's got to be done by those professionally involved in policing. But as part of that process of making sure we've got the total contents of policing done right. I'll give you a particular example of this. Last year, Greater Manchester Police were asked to provide a cohort of policing for the police service in Northern Ireland during the marching season. Now, one of the things that I was asked to my financial permission so to do, of course, it's very difficult. This is part of our country, and all the rest. It's very hard to say that we won't provide that policing support. What is absolutely the case, though, is that we know that the marching season will come every year. We know it's likely to be contentious once again this year. We know that the PSNI will ask once again for reinforcement from the English and Scottish police forces. It is very difficult for us at the moment of tension to say we're not prepared to do that. But if we also have, for example, the capacity for a small riot taking place, as we had 2 years ago in this two parts of Greater Manchester, if we have other kinds of challenges, the EDL deciding to demonstrate in this conurbation, this actually strains the reducing number of police officers in a way that simply isn't consistent with good basic practice of making sure we've got the resilience in our service. Now, that's the conversation that at the moment is being dislocated. And you, as citizens, ought to be concerned about that. Now, you, as an industry, will have different views on what that means and what the direction of travel ought to be. But the point I want to emphasise is this. All the things that I want to do, all the things that Peter Farley as Chief Constable wants to do with Greater Manchester Police Service to transform it, to make it a force for the future, is achievable. It's going to be difficult, but it is achievable. But we've got to make sure that the national framework within which we're operating is one that allows that to happen in your interest, because if not, we'll end up simply with a flashing blue light running up and down the road and may arrest people every now and again. We won't have the problem-solving, totally different type of policing that the modern world demands, and that would be such a fundamental change, because we can do it, and we've got to be given the space to do it.